The Atheist Debates Patreon project presents No Evidence for God. How you doing? Welcome back. Saying that there's no evidence for God is something that I've done many times in the past, and after having various discussions with my debate opponents and interlocutors, I decided that it probably wasn't a good idea to say that. They would point out that testimonial evidence is still evidence, and anecdotal evidence is still evidence, and facts that seem to be consistent with it should count as evidence. And what I was really saying when I would say there's no evidence for God is something closer to, well, there's no good evidence for God, or there's insufficient evidence to warrant accepting that a God exists. And while I'll argue that both of those things are true, ultimately that just gets dismissed as, well, that's just your opinion. It's, hey, you don't think there's sufficient evidence? I do. Now we're stuck. Well, after thinking about it some more, I'm going to talk a little bit about the nature of evidence and why I think it may in fact be fair to say either there is no evidence for God or I'm aware of no evidence for God, because we can't exclude that there's evidence that I'm not aware of. But in order to do that, we have to take a look at what we're talking about when we say evidence for a proposition. And I guess the first thing to note is that when we talk about a proposition, God is not a proposition. It's a hidden proposition. It's another example where we're particularly sloppy with our language when we say, oh, is there any evidence for God? What we mean is there evidence for the proposition God exists? A proposition is a statement. It's an assertion. It needs to have kind of a noun and a verb type structure of this and this. And when we're talking about evidence that's for a specific proposition, it needs to link those components. Not, the God and exists, those need to be linked. That's the whole purpose of the evidence, is to allow us to draw a conclusion on the proposition. Now, anecdotal evidence, testimonial evidence, those things all count. But are they actually evidence for a proposition? If you think about causation, when we look at whether or not something is a cause of another thing, we tend to look at whether or not it's a necessary and sufficient cause. In other words, you would need this thing in order for it to be a cause, and this thing on its own is sufficient to cause the effect that we're talking about. When we talk about that sort of thing, we try to make sure that we're recognizing that correlation is distinct from causation. And what we see a lot when we talk about evidence for the proposition that a God exists is roughly analogous to evidence that is correlated with or consistent with, or worse, not inconsistent with. And so when we talk about evidence for that proposition, the best thing we can do is present facts that tie the features of the proposition together. So let's say we had a proposition, Matt killed Steve, and we'll just assume that it's me and some unnamed Steve. To come up and say, Steve exists, and that is evidence that Matt killed Steve. Steve was killed. That is evidence that Matt killed Steve. Matt exists. That's evidence that Matt killed Steve. And Matt is capable of firing the weapon that killed Steve. That's evidence that Matt killed Steve. So now we have apparently 4 pieces of evidence that Matt killed Steve. And we could go further. Matt was in the same town. Matt owned a gun, etc. You can keep going down this road to say that all this is evidence for the proposition that Matt killed Steve. The problem is that all of those facts, that Steve exists, that I exist, that Steve was killed, and that I'm capable of firing a gun, all the things are true whether I killed Steve or not. So if you look around and you say, well, obviously if Matt didn't exist, then we couldn't possibly claim that he killed Steve. You're correct. My non-existence, or Steve's non-existence, or the fact that Steve is alive, or the fact that Steve wasn't killed with a weapon that's anything like what we're advocating for, all of those things, if they were true, would completely destroy the proposition. So Matt killed Steve is at least a falsifiable proposition. If we found out that Steve was still alive, obviously the proposition is false. And that is one way to look at what evidence should be counted for a proposition and not. Because if we begin with those four, Steve exists, I exist, or Steve existed, I exist, Steve has been killed, and Matt is capable of firing a weapon. If it turns out Steve never existed, these three could still be true in the sense that maybe we couldn't go for Steve as dead, but Matt could be true. It could be true that I exist and that I can fire a weapon, whether Steve is alive or was ever alive. And that's true for each one of those. That the truth of the proposition is consistent with and even a necessary component to the full proposition, but none of them are actually evidence for the proposition. So as we look through the various pieces of evidence that somebody might put forward to say this is evidence for, it seems clear to me that something cannot be evidence for a proposition unless it is both consistent with the claim that the proposition is true and inconsistent with the claim that the proposition is false. It has to be such that it can only be true, or in some cases, most probably be true, under the circumstances of the proposition. That's where we get to the point where we count evidence for a particular proposition. And so when I'm in debates and discussions with theists and they want to say, well, look at the complexity of DNA. Clearly that had to have a mind architect. This is evidence for God. Well, they're essentially asserting that there is no way for DNA to occur unless a God exists. But they haven't demonstrated that at all. They've just asserted it's the case. They are desperately trying to take a piece of evidence, the complexity in coding within DNA, and claim that this is evidence for a particular proposition, but they haven't done any of the work that necessarily ties it to the subject and verb of the proposition. The same is true for look at the trees, or where does morality come from, or why is there something rather than nothing. Addressing these sometimes big questions that we may not have an answer to does not mean that this is evidence for God. And so that leaves us to look at the other things. And probably the most significant one, especially when we've done debates recently about the resurrection and other things, is this notion of eyewitness testimony. Now, if we go back to the proposition that Matt killed Steve, having someone come forward and say, I saw Matt kill Steve, that would be evidence for the proposition. You now have someone who is asserting that they have direct experience with the entire proposition, Matt killed Steve. The question then becomes one of, is that sufficient evidence to conclude that Matt killed Steve? Well, not on its own. We'd have to investigate further and find out have this witness tell what they saw, when they saw it, verify, their truthfulness, or whether or not they had a grudge, whether or not they were, trying to spin this in a certain way. Do they have motives to deceive? Have they been deceived? Did they not see what they thought? All of those things need to be investigated. So yes, it counts as a piece of evidence, and it may turn out to be a really good piece of evidence. If there's somebody you know and trust who comes to you and says, I just saw this, you're probably going to take their word for it unless it's something outlandish or outrageous, extraordinary, and then you're probably going to require a little bit more. So anecdotal, testimonial evidence does count as evidence, but when it comes to the proposition that a God exists, we don't have that. What we have are second and third hand reports of people who are offering their testimonial experiences with something that they interpret as God, or spin as God, or have reached a conclusion as God without it actually being God. There's not anybody who has had an experience with a God existing that has offered testimonial evidence that is subject to any kind of verification or investigation. It would almost be like finding out that there's a witness who said, I saw Matt kill Steve, and yet nobody can demonstrate that Matt exists, Steve was killed, any of that. If that's the only piece, then it can't possibly be enough. If it is with all of these other things that are consistent, if there's a demonstration that I had motive and opportunity, that the forensic evidence pointed to the fact that I had gunshot residue on my hand, and I was seen going into the building, and people knew that we had this beef, and I really didn't like Steve, and all. If you put all of that together, in aggregate, it becomes a compelling case for, but not any individual piece of that is necessarily evidence for the proposition. Well, what if instead of somebody coming forward and saying, I saw Matt kill Steve, we had several people coming forward saying, we saw Matt kill Steve? Well, you'd still have to do the same sort of investigating to determine, the reasonableness of the witnesses, how accurate they are, or whether or not they have a grudge, were they just random bystanders who happened to see this thing. But I'd certainly acknowledge that we saw is going to be a stronger bit of evidence than I saw. And what's even stronger than that is you can see, in the case where maybe the murder was caught on videotape, and now you can watch this for yourself and see what actually took place, and we can show within reason that it was me who was standing there pulling the trigger and killing Steve. By the way, I have no idea who Steve is. I picked a random name of somebody to kill, and maybe the Matt that's guilty isn't even me. But when we're engaged in these discussions about whether or not a God exists, if you say there's no evidence for God, that might be a mistake, because the people who are sitting there think that they have mountains of evidence. And so now we'd have to go through it all and show why it doesn't count as being evidence for a proposition. Instead, it's just facts that are consistent with the proposition. Coming forward to say, in order to fire a gun, someone has to be capable of lifting a gun, and Matt is capable of lifting a gun, and somebody has to be capable of squeezing a trigger, and Matt is capable of doing that, and somebody has to be capable of loading the gun, and Matt or somebody Matt knew could have loaded that gun. Going through, you can come up with an endless series of bits of evidence which are in fact consistent with the proposition, but do not in any way demonstrate the truth or likelihood of the proposition. Because my having hands and my ability to load a gun and fire a gun is completely independent, and it is true whether I killed Steve or not. So, once upon a time, I would say, hey, there's no evidence for God. And today I'm discussing pretty much what I would have meant by that. And then the people I had conversations with came back and said, well, you're just, throwing out the evidence you don't like, and that's entirely subjective. And I get it. At the end of the day, if somebody says that a coin toss is sufficient evidence for them to conclude that a God exists, they toss a coin, heads God exists, tails God doesn't, it lands heads, they get to be the one who decides if that standard of evidence is sufficient to convince them. That's undeniable. Everybody gets to decide. But that doesn't mean that it's merely subjective and that it is reasonable to reach that conclusion. That's where there's a lot of work left to be done. That's where you have to demonstrate that their method, flipping a coin, can't consistently produce a reliable result. And so if that's the case, then either they don't care about whether or not the result is true, or they don't understand that this is not a good way to go about deciding things. Or in some cases, they may have manipulated the result by saying, if in fact a God exists, God would guarantee that this coin would land heads. And the coin landed heads, proving that a God exists, and therefore I'm convinced that a God exists. But we know that coin can land heads or tails, independent of whether or not there's a God. Or at least that is the safe presumption. There's somebody out there who's going to say nothing happens independent of God. Well, that's a cool story, bro. Nice assertion, but how do you demonstrate it? I'm not as worried about people saying there's no evidence for God anymore. Because if we're using it in this context of there's not evidence that specifically supports the proposition and is true only in the case where the proposition is true, as long as that's what we mean by no evidence, then I don't think it's an issue. But it's worth being aware that there are people who are going to say, hey, you're just dismissing anecdotal and testimonial evidence. Because no, I'm actually not. I'm saying that evidence is insufficient and something that in many cases we just can't investigate. If you had preachers running around regrowing limbs and claiming that God did it, we still wouldn't necessarily be able to show that it was because of a God, but at least you would have evidence for the proposition that they can do what they say they do. And if these are the experts and they're attributing it to God, then okay, that might work as evidence towards a proposition. The most important thing here is that once upon a time I would say there's no evidence for God. Then I stopped saying it entirely, or tried to, because I would rather be clear and honest in saying that, okay, there's not good evidence for God or not sufficient evidence for God, which sends us down this line of discussing what counts as good evidence and what should count as sufficient evidence. I'm now not very bothered at all by saying there's no evidence for God or no evidence for the proposition that God exists. Or I have not been presented with any evidence that a God exists, because the only thing that I've been presented with are things which are seemingly true whether there's a God or not, and that includes the anecdotal accounts that we can't investigate. We have no idea. Take a look at the Gospels. They're anonymous. We don't know who they are. We can't investigate. It was many, many years ago. And in actuality, I find this to be a fairly strong argument against the proposition that a God exists, because it seems to me rather absurd that a God would reveal this important information in writings that change and are altered in languages that die out at a time when future generations wouldn't be able to go back and investigate and determine how reliable a particular account was. We have no way. It's like trying to solve a murder that's 2,000 years old. That's incredibly difficult. And when people come up and they say things like, well, what about the empty tomb? The empty tomb is evidence for God, evidence for Jesus' resurrection. Well, first of all, no, it's not. An empty tomb is the sort of thing that would be required to be true if, in fact, Jesus raised from the dead. But an empty tomb is not evidence for the proposition that someone was raised from the dead. And worse than that, which empty tomb? What empty tomb do we have? What we have are reports that a tomb was empty. I can't go visit a tomb and confirm that, in fact, it was Jesus's, and confirm that, 3 days later the stone was rolled away, or a day and a half later, and Jesus rose. None of that is anything we can confirm. And so when people talk about, oh, the empty tomb is evidence for Jesus' resurrection or the divinity of Jesus or God, they're just wrong. It is evidence that is consistent with their claim, and kind of like a correlation, but it's not evidence that demonstrates the truth or likelihood of the claim. Because an empty tomb could exist even in the absence of someone being resurrected. Meanwhile, we don't even have that. So this was a quick look at evidence. I'm going to probably dig in on this some more later to see if there's already existing, because there may be, I don't remotely know everything about this, or words that we can use to clarify this. Because despite what some people think, I'm not just sitting here saying, there's no God, and now I'm going to find every way possible to shoot down this notion that there's a God. I genuinely want the best evidence to come forward and the best arguments to come forward. And if in fact there is evidence for the proposition that a God exists, that's something that I think we would all want to know and care about, or at least most of us. But when it comes to just saying there's no evidence for God, I think I'm okay with that now. It may not be all I say on the subject, but I'm not as bothered by that statement as I was before. My desire to be as honest and accurate as possible when having these discussions moved me away from something that may actually be sufficiently accurate that we shouldn't have to avoid it. As far as I can tell, there is no evidence for God. See you next time.
This video is made possible by supporters of the Atheist Debates Patreon project. You can find more information and add your support at patreon.com/atheistdebates.